Let me ask you something personal. Think about the last time someone let you down. Not a stranger. Someone you actually knew. Someone you trusted. Maybe a friend who slowly stopped showing up. A colleague who smiled to your face and talked behind your back. A partner who said all the right things and then did something that made you feel like you never really knew them at all. Now, here's the real question. Were there signs? Almost certainly, yes. There were signs, there were patterns, there were little moments that didn't quite add up. A flicker of something off, a response that felt slightly wrong, a silence that lasted a beat too long. You noticed them. You just didn't know what to do with them. That's not your fault. You were never taught how to read people. None of us were. We were taught to be polite, to give the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions. And while those are beautiful qualities in a human being, they can also make you incredibly easy to disappoint. What you're about to learn in this book isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone you meet. It's not about building walls or turning cold. It's about developing one of the rarest and most valuable skills a person can have in the modern world, the ability to see people clearly. Not as you hope they are, not as they present themselves, but as they actually are, revealed through their behavior, their patterns, their silences, and their reactions under pressure. Because here's the truth that most people spend years figuring out the hard way. People don't hide who they are. They show you every single day. You just have to know what to look for. And by the end of this book, you will. Part 1. The Performance and the Person Behind It. Chapter 1. Everyone is playing a role, including you. There's a coffee shop near a busy train station where hundreds of people pass through every morning. Watch them for 30 minutes and something interesting happens. You start to see the same show playing out over and over again. The man in the sharp suit who laughs a little too loudly at his own stories. The woman who checks her phone every 90 seconds but sighs like she wishes people would just leave her alone. The guy who holds the door open with a big smile but doesn't make eye contact with the cashier. Everyone is performing something. This isn't a criticism. It's one of the most fundamental truths about human beings. From the moment we're old enough to understand that our behavior affects how others respond to us, we start adjusting. We start shaping ourselves to fit. We learn quickly and quietly that acceptance isn't automatic. It has to be earned, and so we perform. Think about your own life for a second. You probably speak differently to your boss than you do to your best friend. You probably carry yourself differently at a job interview than you do on a lazy Sunday morning. You laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You hold back opinions that might create friction. You say, "I'm fine," when someone asks how you're doing, even when you're not. This is not dishonesty. This is survival. Human beings are wired for social connection, and social systems reward people who fit in and punish those who don't. So we adapt. We bend. We perform. The problem isn't the performance itself. The problem is forgetting that a performance is happening at all. When you forget that people are performing, when you take the role they're playing at face value, you stop seeing the person and start seeing the character they've constructed. And that character, charming and consistent as it might seem, is not the full picture. Why this matters more than you think. Most of the pain we experience in relationships, the betrayals, the disappointments, the moments where someone reveals a side of themselves we never saw coming, happens because we were watching the performance and calling it the truth. We got comfortable with the role. We liked the character. And then, under pressure or over time, the mask slipped, and we found ourselves asking, "Who were you this whole time?" Here's what experienced observers understand that most people don't. The mask always slips eventually, not because people are deceptive, though some are, but because maintaining a performance is exhausting. It requires constant energy, constant monitoring, constant adjustment, and the more comfortable someone becomes with you, the less effort they put into the performance. This is actually useful information. What you see at the beginning of any relationship is people at their most curated, their most intentional, their most careful. What you see 6 months in, 2 years in, under stress and conflict, when there's nothing to gain, that's much closer to the truth. The face behind the mask. So, how do you get past the performance? Not by demanding authenticity, not by confronting people with your observations, but by learning to look in different places. Instead of listening to what people say about themselves, watch what they do when no one's watching. Instead of trusting declarations, watch patterns. Instead of believing intentions, watch habits. Because here's the thing about habits. They're honest. Habits form slowly, reinforced over hundreds of small moments, and they don't pause to manage impressions. They just happen. When someone is running on autopilot, tired, distracted, comfortable, or stressed, what comes out is not performance. What comes out is character. The person who is kind to you but routinely short with service workers is showing you something important about themselves. The person who talks about loyalty but disappears when things get complicated is giving you information about who they actually are when it costs something. Your job isn't to judge that information. Your job is to see it. Chapter 2. Words are the least reliable thing about a person. Here's something almost no one tells you. Words are the least reliable form of human communication, not because people are liars, though sometimes they are, but because words are filtered through something much more powerful than truth. They're filtered through self-image. When someone speaks, they're not just conveying information. They're managing how they want to be perceived. They're protecting something. They're constructing a version of reality that makes them look okay or good or justified. This happens constantly, mostly unconsciously. The person who says they don't care what others think cares deeply. They just want to be seen as someone who doesn't. The person who says they're totally fine with whatever has preferences they don't feel safe expressing. The person who describes themselves as brutally honest usually means they'll be honest about everyone else but fiercely defensive about themselves. Words come from intention. Behavior comes from conditioning. And conditioning, the deeply ingrained habits, defaults, and reflexes that a person has developed over years of lived experience, is far harder to fake. The gap that reveals everything. There's a space between what people say and what they do, and that space is where the truth lives. Think about someone who says they care about you but is consistently unavailable, or someone who promises to change but keeps repeating the same behavior, or someone who claims to value honesty but goes silent when honesty would be inconvenient. These gaps aren't random. They form for specific reasons. They appear when the image someone wants to project conflicts with who they actually are, when what they know they should be clashes with what they're conditioned to do, when intention meets resistance from reality. The person who wants to be seen as generous but hesitates when it actually costs them something is showing you the gap. The person who talks about wanting deep connection but keeps every relationship at arm's length is showing you the gap. You don't need to analyze the gap. You don't need to confront it. You just need to notice it, because the gap is information. And information, consistent, repeated behavioral information, doesn't lie the way words sometimes do. Why excuses are a signal, not an explanation. When there's a gap between someone's words and their behavior, something almost always fills that gap. An excuse. And here's what's important to understand about excuses. They're not random. They're not accidents. They are psychological smokescreens. They do a very specific job. They redirect your attention away from the pattern and back toward the explanation. They were stressed. They had a lot going on. They didn't mean it like that. They weren't themselves. It's complicated. All of these might be technically true. Stress is real. Circumstances are real. People do have bad days. And once or twice, these explanations are legitimate and worth accepting. But when excuses become frequent, when every single time the behavior falls short, there's a ready explanation, that's no longer an excuse. That's a pattern within a pattern. A person who is consistently late will always have a reason. A person who consistently avoids accountability will always have context. A person who consistently crosses your limits will always have a justification. What matters is not whether the excuse sounds reasonable. What matters is whether the behavior changes. If it doesn't, and you keep accepting the explanation, you're not giving someone the benefit of the doubt. You're giving them permission to keep going. Reading the small things, most people wait for big signals. A dramatic betrayal, an obvious lie, an undeniable moment of disrespect. But human behavior is most honest in its smallest expressions. The way someone responds when plans change at the last minute. The way they treat someone who can do nothing for them. The way their tone shifts when they're inconvenienced. The way they react to a gentle disagreement versus a full-on challenge. These micro moments don't get planned. They don't get filtered. They just happen. And in those unplanned, unfiltered moments, you get to see something rare. The person as they actually are. Experienced readers of people don't wait for the big reveal. They pay attention to the small stuff consistently over time. And over time, small stuff adds up into a very clear picture. Part 2. The emotional body doesn't lie. Chapter 3. What a person's reactions are really telling you. Have you ever been in a conversation where everything seemed perfectly calm on the surface? Reasonable words, measured tone, a polite exchange, but something underneath felt completely wrong? Like watching a beautiful building with a crack running all the way up the side. That crack is emotion. And emotion, unlike words, is almost impossible to fake consistently. Here's why this matters. People can choose what to say. They can rehearse their responses. They can craft their explanations. But emotional reactions, the kind that rise before the brain has time to catch them, those tell a different story. When someone gets disproportionately angry about something small, something important has been touched. When someone goes rigid and defensive the moment you ask a simple question, a fragile self-image is protecting itself. When someone withdraws the instant vulnerability appears in a conversation, fear is operating. These aren't character flaws to judge. They're signals to read. The secret language of overreaction. One of the most revealing signals in human behavior is overreaction. When someone's response is larger than the situation seems to warrant, you're not witnessing drama for drama's sake. You're witnessing psychological importance. Think about it from the inside. Things we feel neutral about don't provoke strong reactions. It's the things that matter, the things we're afraid of losing, the wounds we haven't finished healing, the insecurities we work hard to protect. Those things light us up when they're touched. So when you see a strong reaction, ask yourself, what is this reaction protecting? Someone who becomes furious when their authority is questioned is protecting something about their sense of worth and status. Someone who bursts into anxiety when plans change is protecting a need for control. Someone who shuts down and goes cold when emotions get intense is protecting themselves from being hurt the way they were hurt before. None of these people are broken. They're just human beings with histories, people who learned certain reactions because at some point those reactions worked. The reaction is a messenger. It's telling you where the tender spots are. Defensiveness is a map. Of all the emotional signals, defensiveness is one of the most useful to understand. A defensive person is not protecting the truth. They're protecting their self-concept, their story about who they are and what kind of person they are. When that story feels threatened, the defense mechanism kicks in. This is why you can have a gentle, non-accusatory conversation with someone and still trigger a disproportionate reaction. It's not about how you said it. It's about what you touched. If someone's identity is fragile in a particular area, their competence, their honesty, their loyalty, even the softest question about that area can feel like an attack. Watch for defensiveness, not to exploit it, but to understand the map it's drawing for you. Where someone gets defensive tells you where their psychological territory is, where they feel unsafe, where their sense of self is shaky, where the old wounds still haven't fully closed. Anger, control, and what's actually being threatened, anger, is often misread as strength. In reality, most anger is a response to powerlessness. When someone gets angry, something they relied on has been disrupted. Their sense of control, their expectation of respect, their assumed authority, their predicted outcome. Anger is the nervous system's attempt to restore that disruption, to push back against the thing that felt threatening. This is why someone might react with real anger to a simple limit you set. The limit disrupts their expectation of access or control. This is why disagreement sometimes produces rage instead of discussion. The disagreement threatens the sense of being right, being dominant, being in charge of the narrative. Calm people, genuinely calm, not just suppressed, don't need to intimidate. Secure people don't need to overpower. When you see anger, look beneath it. What was threatened? What was expected that didn't happen? What does this person feel they need to maintain that is now at risk? That question will tell you more about a person than hours of pleasant conversation. The quiet signals, withdrawal and silence. Not all emotional responses are loud. Some of the most important ones are almost invisible. Withdrawal, going quiet, pulling back, becoming suddenly unavailable, is often more informative than explosion. It's a learned strategy that usually develops early in life, in environments where direct expression of emotion wasn't safe. When conflict appeared, withdrawal provided protection. When vulnerability felt dangerous, distance felt like safety. Someone who withdraws instead of communicating is often not being indifferent. They're being afraid. The silence is not emptiness. It's a very full room of unexpressed feeling, tightly contained. Understanding this doesn't mean you should pursue, push, or corner someone who withdraws. It means you should read the withdrawal for what it is: information about a person's emotional history and their default strategies for managing discomfort. Over time, the emotional patterns you observe in someone form a profile. Some people explode and recover quickly. Some carry things for weeks without saying a word. Some swing between extremes. These patterns tell you how safe, stable, and reliable someone is emotionally, and they're far more accurate than anything the person might say about their emotional intelligence. Chapter 4. What silence actually communicates. We live in a world that's terrified of silence. Fill the pause. Keep the conversation going. Say something, anything, to avoid that moment where the air becomes still and heavy. Most people will do almost anything to escape the discomfort of a genuine silence. But silence, used wisely and read carefully, is one of the most revealing forces in human communication. When words stop, performance has nowhere to hide. The careful crafting of responses, the impression management, the charm and the narrative, all of it depends on language. Take language away, even temporarily, and what remains is unfiltered. Posture, expression, timing, the pace of breath, the direction of eyes, the quality of presence. Some people are completely comfortable in silence. They lean into it, sit with it, let it breathe. Others can barely tolerate 3 seconds of it before they rush to fill the space. This difference alone tells you something significant. Comfort with silence usually signals internal stability, the kind of person who doesn't need external noise to feel okay. Discomfort reveals dependence on validation or control through language. The pressure of unspoken space. Here's something interesting about silence. It creates pressure, psychological pressure, and that pressure has a way of drawing out the truth, an unanswered message, a pause after a question where an answer was expected. A quiet, steady look held a beat longer than usual. These moments are uncomfortable for most people, and discomfort has a way of loosening the grip on carefully managed presentations. People fill silence instinctively. They volunteer information they weren't asked for. They over-explain. They clarify things that didn't need clarifying. They justify without being accused. And what emerges in those spontaneous, unplanned moments is often far more revealing than anything that would have come out of a direct interrogation. Skilled therapists know this. Effective negotiators know this. Anyone who has learned the art of patient observation knows this. You don't extract truth by demanding it. You create the conditions for it to surface on its own. Reading the quality of silence. Not all silence is the same. The type of silence someone uses, and when they use it, tells you very different things. The silence that follows a confrontation about behavior is often the silence of awareness. Someone who knows they've been seen is recalibrating. They're not absent. They're calculating. The silence someone retreats into when things get emotional is often the silence of avoidance. Not thoughtful processing, but protective distance. The feelings are there. The person just isn't ready or willing to face them directly. The silence of a genuinely present, attentive person, the one who isn't rushing to speak, who holds space without anxiety, who responds when the moment actually calls for it, rather than filling every gap. That's the silence of emotional regulation and inner security. And then there's the weaponized silence, the deliberate withholding of communication as a form of punishment or control. This kind of silence has a particular quality to it. It feels intentional, targeted, designed to make someone else feel the discomfort. It's not about the person processing or protecting themselves. It's about using absence to exert influence. What your own relationship to silence says about you. Here's a worthwhile question to sit with. How comfortable are you with silence? Not productive solitude or intentional rest. Real silence. The kind that appears in the middle of a conversation and just stays. If you feel pulled to fill it, ask yourself why. What does the silence seem to demand from you? What are you afraid might happen if you just let it be? Your answers to those questions reveal something about your own emotional patterns, the tendencies you bring into your observations of others. Because the most effective readers of human behavior aren't just watching other people. They're also watching themselves. They notice their own impulses, they catch their own projections, and they learn to tell the difference between what they're seeing and what they're feeling. Silence is where that kind of self-awareness begins. Part 3, The Mirror Test, How People Treat Others. Chapter 5, The One Test That Never Fails. There's a test you can run on almost any person in your life, and it's one of the most accurate ways to understand what you're actually dealing with. It doesn't require a difficult conversation or an extended period of time. You can do it just by paying attention. Watch how they treat people who can't do anything for them, not how they treat you, especially not in the early stages of a relationship when everyone tends to be on their best behavior. Watch how they treat the waiter who got the order wrong. Watch how they talk about an old friend they've drifted from. Watch how they respond to the person at the counter who is slow, uncertain, or making their life slightly more inconvenient. In those moments, there's nothing strategic at play. No image to protect with you watching, no outcome to secure, no impression to carefully manage. What you're seeing is the person's relationship with other human beings when there's no incentive to perform. And that relationship, unmediated by strategy or self-interest, is exactly what you will eventually experience yourself. Why they're different with me is often a trap. One of the most common pieces of self-deception in human relationships is the belief that someone is fundamentally different in their relationship with you than they are with everyone else. I get it. It feels good to believe that. It feels special. You've seen someone at their best, and you want to believe that best is who they really are. You want to be the exception, the person who brings out their better nature. But here's what experienced observers understand. People adapt their behavior based on the relationship. What they don't do is transform their character. If someone is consistently dismissive of others, that dismissiveness lives inside them whether you're there or not. If someone manipulates, belittles, or avoids accountability in other relationships, those aren't habits they leave at the door when they walk into their relationship with you. They might not surface immediately. Comfort, familiarity, and time have a way of allowing deeper patterns to emerge. What you saw in the first months might be the curated version. What shows up 2 years in during a moment of real stress or conflict is the fuller picture. Character doesn't change because of proximity. It reveals itself over time. How people talk about others is how they'll eventually talk about you. Pay very close attention to how someone speaks about the people who aren't in the room. Do they gossip easily? Do they mock vulnerabilities? Do they frame themselves as the wronged party in every story without exception? Do they share other people's private information freely, treating confidence as something that expires? Here's the uncomfortable truth. However, someone speaks about others when those others can't hear is exactly how they will eventually speak about you when you can't hear. The person who constantly talks about how crazy their ex is probably tells very convenient stories. The person who mocks their colleagues' insecurities will eventually turn that same mockery somewhere closer. The person who shares secrets easily will not suddenly develop discretion when the secret is yours. This is not about judging people for being imperfect. We all talk about others sometimes. The question is the pattern. Is there consistent respect in the way this person discusses other human beings? Is there a baseline of dignity in how they narrate other people's stories? If not, you're not watching a trait that will be suspended for your benefit. You're watching a way of relating to people, and you are a person. Respect that only flows upward isn't really respect. This is worth its own moment because it's one of the most important principles in reading people. Almost anyone can be respectful and charming toward someone who has power over them. People are polite to authority. People are warm to those who might be useful. People are accommodating to anyone who could affect their outcomes. That tells you almost nothing about who they actually are. What tells you everything is how respect flows downward. How does this person treat people who cannot affect their circumstances? How do they behave when they are the one with the advantage, the status, the authority, the power in a given interaction? A person who wields whatever power they have with gentleness, humor, and awareness of impact is showing you something real. Internal integrity that doesn't depend on external validation. A person who uses advantage to dominate, diminish, or control is showing you something just as real. Insecurity dressed as authority. You don't need to extrapolate or imagine. Watch what's already in front of you. The information is being offered constantly. Chapter 6. Insecurity is never as hidden as people think. Here's something that might surprise you. The traits we most often mistake for confidence, loudness, certainty, dominance, the need to be right, are frequently the surface expressions of something much less secure underneath. True confidence has a particular quality. It's quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself or defend itself or constantly seek confirmation that it's valid. Genuinely confident people are comfortable with disagreement, comfortable with silence, comfortable with situations they can't control, because their sense of worth doesn't depend on any particular outcome. Insecurity operates differently. Because it depends on external validation to feel okay, it experiences the world as fundamentally unstable. Every disagreement is a potential threat. Every challenge to status or opinion feels like an attack. Every sign of someone else's success registers as a comment on their own worth. And that instability leaks constantly. The control tell one of the clearest signs of insecurity is the need for control, not confidence, not leadership, not good organizational skills, the compulsive need to manage outcomes, guide narratives, and reduce uncertainty wherever possible. Insecure people micromanage conversations. They correct minor details that don't matter. They need to be right more than they need to find the truth. They direct others not because they have vision, but because uncertainty is physically uncomfortable for them. When someone feels genuinely secure in themselves, in their relationships, in their sense of value, they trust themselves to handle whatever emerges. They don't need to pre-control every variable because they know they can respond to what actually shows up. Control reveals fear. The more tightly someone grips the wheel, the more afraid they are of what happens if they let go. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing the behavior. It means seeing it accurately. Comparison as constant background noise. Secure people notice other people's achievements. They might even feel moments of envy. That's just being human. But they don't live in constant comparison. They don't feel diminished by someone else's success because their sense of worth isn't tied to being ahead or being the most recognized or being the one everyone's paying attention to. Insecure people live in a very different internal world. Other people's success doesn't register as neutral or even inspiring. It registers as a comment on their own inadequacy. Achievements that should be irrelevant somehow feel personal. This leaks into behavior in subtle ways, downplaying what others have accomplished, redirecting conversations back to themselves, finding a reason why someone else's success isn't really that impressive. These are rarely conscious choices. They're reflexes, protective reactions designed to manage the internal discomfort of comparison. When you notice this pattern in someone, you're looking at a person who is fighting an internal war that has nothing to do with you. The behavior might feel targeted, but it's not about you. It's about the noise they carry inside. The overreaction that maps inner fragility. Secure people absorb feedback. They might not like it. They might need a moment, but they don't collapse or explode when challenged because criticism doesn't touch the foundation of who they are. Insecure people experience criticism, correction, or even gentle questioning as existential threat. Their identity is built on a specific narrative, a story about who they are that has to remain intact for them to feel okay. Anything that threatens that story doesn't feel like information. It feels like an attack. So when someone reacts to minor challenges with disproportionate defensiveness, you're not watching someone who's difficult. You're watching someone whose sense of self is fragile, someone who needs the narrative undisturbed because they haven't yet found a way to feel okay without it. This understanding gives you something important. You stop taking it personally. The reaction is about the internal structure of that person, not about you. And once you see that, you can make clear-eyed decisions about how close you want to stand. Part 4. Pressure, Perception, and the Stories we tell ourselves. Chapter 7. Pressure is the most honest situation in the world. You can learn almost everything you need to know about a person by watching what they do when things get hard. Not hypothetically hard, actually hard. Deadline pressure. Conflict without easy resolution. Plans that fall apart at the worst possible moment. The loss of something they were counting on. The moment when being the person they claim to be costs something real. Comfortable circumstances let almost anyone perform reasonably well. When life is smooth, patience is easy. Generosity is easy. Composure is easy. There's nothing threatening the image, nothing pulling at the carefully maintained presentation. Pressure changes everything. Under real pressure, the brain stops reflecting and starts reacting. There's no time to carefully manage impressions, no energy left for filtering. What emerges is not the performance, it's the conditioning. The deepest grooved habits and responses take over because when the conscious mind is occupied with the stress, the autopilot engages. And autopilot is honest. What stress really shows you? Some people become focused under pressure, clear, decisive. They narrow in, prioritize, and move efficiently through difficulty. This isn't some kind of heroic virtue. It's a signal that this person has a nervous system that can tolerate uncertainty without shutting down. They've developed, through experience, through practice, through working on themselves, the capacity to be useful in difficult situations. Others become rigid under pressure. They double down on whatever they were already doing, even when it isn't working. They get brittle and defensive. They stop taking in new information because their nervous system is already at capacity, just managing the discomfort. Some become avoidant. They disappear. They postpone. They create distance between themselves and the difficulty, waiting for it to resolve on its own or for someone else to carry the weight. And some externalize. They spread the stress outward. They become sharp, reactive, critical. They find fault. They provoke conflict as a way of redistributing the internal pressure they're feeling onto the environment around them. None of these are permanent sentences. People can grow, but the pattern that emerges consistently under pressure is a reliable signal. More reliable than what someone says about who they are, more reliable than how they behave when things are easy. Values. Under pressure are real values. It's relatively easy to claim integrity, to say you value honesty, accountability, fairness, respect. These are pleasant things to believe about yourself, and no one can immediately prove you wrong. Pressure proves you wrong or confirms you right. When holding a value costs something, when honesty would be uncomfortable, when accountability would be embarrassing, when fairness would require you to give something up, that's when you find out whether the value is real or just a pleasant self-description. Watch what someone does when being honest would make them look bad. Watch what happens when accountability would require them to admit a mistake. Watch how loyalty is defined when it becomes genuinely inconvenient. Watch whether integrity survives the moment when compromising it would be easier. These are not abstract philosophical tests. They happen every day in small ways, in ordinary situations, and every time someone chooses comfort over principle, they're showing you something about the architecture of their actual values. Conflict, as a character reveal conflict, is pressure at its most concentrated, which makes it one of the most informative situations you can observe. When someone is in genuine disagreement with you, when they feel challenged, questioned, or contradicted, watch what happens. Do they listen to understand, or do they listen to respond? Do they stay curious about your perspective, or do they become focused entirely on defending their own? Do they separate the issue from the person, or do they make the disagreement feel personal? People who can't tolerate disagreement often experience it as rejection. Being opposed feels, at some internal level, like being discarded. So their reaction is less about the content of the dispute and more about the emotional threat they're processing. People who can stay grounded in conflict, who can disagree without making it into something larger, who can challenge and be challenged without it destabilizing them, are showing you something rare and genuinely valuable. The ability to separate identity from opinion, the capacity to hold their own perspective while remaining genuinely open to yours. That capacity in a person is one of the most reliable indicators of psychological maturity. The excuse that explains too much. One of the most common mistakes people make when reading someone's behavior under pressure is explaining it away in real time. They were stressed. They had a lot going on. It was an unusual situation. They're not normally like this. These explanations might be accurate in isolated incidents. People do have bad days. Unusual circumstances do produce unusual behavior. Once or twice, with good reason, this kind of generous interpretation is fair. But there's a critical distinction between explaining an isolated event and excusing a pattern. If stress consistently produces disrespect, avoidance, or aggression, if every time the pressure rises, the behavior falls, then the stress isn't creating the behavior, it's revealing it. Understanding why something happens doesn't change what happened. And if you keep explaining behavior that keeps repeating, you're not giving someone grace. You're building a story that protects you from having to update your perception. Chapter 8. Why you keep getting people wrong. You've been misjudging people your whole life. So have I. So has everyone. And the reason isn't what most people assume. It's not that people are too complex to read. It's not that you're not perceptive enough. It's not that you need more information. The reason is distortion. Your perception, my perception, everyone's perception, is filtered. It doesn't just receive reality. It processes it through layers of emotion, memory, hope, fear, and personal value systems that shape what we notice and what we miss, what we emphasize, and what we minimize. Until you understand those filters, you'll keep seeing people not as they are, but as your mind reshapes them to be. Projection, the most common distortion. Projection is the tendency to assume that other people think, feel, and value things the way you do. If you're honest, you expect honesty. If you're loyal, you assume loyalty. If you would tell someone directly when something is wrong, you believe others will too. These assumptions feel natural. They feel like basic human courtesy. But they're not. They're projections of your own internal framework onto people who may operate from entirely different ones. Projection is comforting because it makes the world feel orderly and shared. If everyone basically works the same way you do, then the rules are predictable and manageable. But human behavior doesn't follow universal rules. It follows individual conditioning, shaped by specific experiences, specific environments, specific emotional histories that are unique to each person. People are not wrong for being different, but they are misread when you assume similarity that doesn't exist. The corrective is to slow down and replace assumptions with observations. Instead of assuming someone processes conflict the same way you do, watch how they actually respond to it. Instead of assuming someone's silence means the same thing your silence means, watch the behavior that surrounds it. Replace the map you're projecting with the territory that's actually in front of you. Hope as a lens that bends reality. Hope is one of the most beautiful human qualities. It's also one of the most distorting forces in perception. When you want something to be true, when you're invested in a relationship, an outcome, a version of someone, hope fills the gaps with possibility. It interprets ambiguity generously. It delays conclusions. It turns patterns into exceptions and exceptions into explanations. Hope says they'll change. Hope says this time will be different. Hope says the good moments are the real person and the difficult moments are the anomaly. This isn't stupidity or weakness. It's what happens when emotional investment meets uncertainty. The mind, trying to protect the connection you value, naturally gravitates toward interpretations that preserve it. But here's the cost. Hope makes words louder than actions. It amplifies what someone says and quiets what they do. It privileges the declaration over the pattern. And because hope feels like optimism, like emotional generosity, like faith in people, it rarely gets examined. It feels like a virtue, so it doesn't get questioned the way a more obviously distorting emotion would. The question worth asking yourself when you find hope operating, is this hope based on evidence, or is it based on what I need to believe? Familiar pain and its strange comfort. One of the most counterintuitive truths in human psychology is this. The mind doesn't automatically move toward what's good for it. It moves toward what's familiar. People who grew up in environments where love was inconsistent, where connection came with uncertainty, where closeness required constant proving of worth, those people often find consistency unsettling and emotional unpredictability completely natural. Not because they prefer pain, but because that's the template they were given for what relationships feel like. So the person who keeps choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable isn't making a random mistake. They're following a deeply ingrained template that says, this is how intimacy works. And the person who shows up with reliability and consistency and calm, who doesn't create drama or uncertainty, can actually feel wrong. Too easy. Too simple. Missing something. This is one of the most painful distortions, and recognizing it in yourself is genuinely difficult work. But it's some of the most important work you can do, because until you see the template, you keep following it, and following it means keeping score by the wrong measure. The distance that restores clarity. Emotional attachment creates bias. This is not a character flaw. It's biology. The nervous system prioritizes connection, and connection affects perception. When you're close to someone, when you care about them, when you need them, when your life is intertwined with theirs, your brain automatically minimizes information that threatens the relationship and magnifies information that supports it. It's not doing this to deceive you. It's doing this to preserve something it values. This is why a degree of distance, not coldness, not withdrawal, but some amount of emotional space, often restores clarity. It doesn't eliminate care. It creates enough room to observe without having a stake in the outcome of what you see. If you want to understand someone accurately, practice seeing them without needing a specific answer. Practice observing their behavior without pre-deciding what it means. Practice letting the pattern be what it is, rather than what you need it to be. This is hard, it takes practice, and it's one of the most valuable skills you can develop. Part 5. Becoming the Calm Observer. Chapter 9. You can see clearly and still stay warm. Let me address the fear that's probably been sitting quietly in the back of your mind as you've been reading this. If I start seeing people this clearly, if I watch the patterns, read the behaviors, notice the gaps, will I stop being able to connect? Will I become suspicious, guarded, emotionally unavailable? Will understanding people make me unable to trust them? This is a real and fair concern, and the answer is no, but only if you understand what clarity actually is. Clarity is not coldness. Seeing people accurately is not the same as seeing them cynically. Understanding patterns doesn't require withdrawing from connection. In fact, it's the misunderstanding, the confusion, the hope-based distortion, the projection that most often creates the kind of prolonged disappointment and emotional exhaustion that actually does make people cold. People don't become guarded because they understand too much. They become guarded because they were hurt repeatedly without the understanding to process it. They built walls because they couldn't see what was coming and they got ambushed one too many times. Clarity is protective in a way that prevention is protective. It doesn't stop you from connecting. It helps you connect in ways that are more likely to be genuinely good for you. The false choice between empathy and awareness. We've inherited a subtle cultural idea that being kind and being perceptive are somehow in tension. That to be truly loving and open, you need to give everyone the benefit of the doubt indefinitely. That awareness is somehow incompatible with warmth. This idea is worth challenging because it creates a false and damaging choice. Empathy without awareness becomes self-sacrifice. You give without calibration. You invest without information. You extend yourself endlessly toward people who may not be capable of receiving what you're offering, let alone reciprocating it. Awareness without empathy becomes detachment. You see accurately, but you can't feel. You understand people, but you don't care about them. You're safe, but you're also isolated. What actually works, what emotional maturity looks like in practice, is grounded understanding. You see the person clearly, including their limitations and their wounds, and you still choose how you engage. You still bring warmth. You still bring care, but you bring them from a foundation of accurate perception rather than hopeful illusion. You can recognize someone's limitations without resenting them. You can see someone's pattern without becoming their judge. You can understand someone's wounds without placing yourself inside them. That's not coldness. That's mature compassion. Seeing without absorbing. One of the most practical skills in reading people is what we might call separation. The ability to understand something without having to carry it. When you notice that someone is insecure, you don't have to absorb their insecurity. When you see that someone is manipulative, you don't have to engage with the manipulation. When you recognize that someone is emotionally unstable, you don't have to be destabilized by their instability. Understanding is not obligation. Seeing is not surrender. You can notice that a person gossips without gossiping with them. You can see that someone avoids responsibility without picking up their responsibility. You can observe that someone uses emotional reactivity to control situations without being controlled by it. This separation, this clean space between understanding and engagement, is what allows you to stay warm without being exposed. It lets you be present without being permissive. It lets you listen without being influenced in ways you haven't chosen. Containment is not cruelty, it's self-respect in practice. Boundaries that come from clarity, not anger. Most people experience boundaries as something that comes out of frustration or pain, a line drawn after too many times being hurt. And when boundaries come from that place, they can feel angry, punitive, and reactive. But when boundaries come from clarity, there's something entirely different. They're not reactions. They're intelligent adjustments based on accurate information. When you understand clearly that someone gossips, you naturally don't overshare with them. Not because you're punishing them, not because you're angry, but because you know what they do with information and you make an informed choice. When you understand that someone avoids accountability, you naturally don't rely on them for high-stakes commitments, not out of resentment, out of realism. When you understand that someone's consistency is conditional, that they show up when it's convenient and disappear when it's not, you naturally don't build plans that require their unconditional presence, because you see what's true. This kind of boundary feels different from the inside and the outside. There's no drama in it, no hostility, no punishment. It's just an accurate response to accurate information, and it preserves your peace in a way that anger-based boundaries rarely can. Releasing the urge to fix. One of the most liberating things that happens when you develop genuine clarity about human behavior is that you start to let go of the impulse to fix people. When you misread people, when you project, when you hope against evidence, when you interpret patterns as mistakes instead of character, you naturally believe that the right conversation, the right effort, the right amount of love or patience will shift things. You believe change is just around the corner. You invest in the potential you see rather than the reality you're standing in. Accurate perception changes this. When you see what's actually there, not what could theoretically be there, you stop negotiating with reality. You stop investing heavily in unlikely outcomes. You stop confusing what someone might become with who they consistently are. This is not pessimism, it's efficiency. It's the difference between spending your energy on what can genuinely grow and spending it on what has shown you repeatedly and clearly that it isn't growing. You can care about someone and still accept what's true about them. You can love people and still choose how much you invest. Releasing the urge to fix isn't abandonment. It's one of the most mature things a person can do. Chapter 10. The Quiet Power of Seeing Clearly. Let's talk about power, not the kind that comes from dominance or control or being the loudest voice in the room, not the kind that requires other people to be smaller for you to feel bigger, not the kind that needs constant confirmation that it exists. Real power, the kind that endures, the kind that actually makes your life better and your relationships more genuine, is quiet. It's internal, and it belongs almost exclusively to the person who can observe without being pulled into reaction. The calm observer. Why? Reaction is loss of control. Every time you react impulsively, you give something away. You reveal where your edges are. You show what affects you. You demonstrate what you need. And in doing so, you hand the power in that interaction to whoever provoked the reaction, whether they meant to or not. Reactive people experience themselves as authentic and direct. Often, though, what they're experiencing is a surrender of their internal state to external triggers. When someone can provoke you reliably, they can steer you. They can predict where you'll go, and they can use that prediction. The calm observer doesn't eliminate emotion. They delay response. They create a pause between stimulus and reaction. And in that pause, something important lives. Choice. When you can choose your response rather than having it chosen for you by your emotional state, the dynamic in any interaction shifts fundamentally. You're no longer being steered. You're driving. Stillness as the condition for seeing. Here's something counterintuitive. The more still you are, the more you see. When you're reactive, your attention is on your own internal experience, what you're feeling, what you want to say, how you're being perceived. You're managing your own state. And while you're doing that, you're missing what's happening in front of you. When you're calm and still, your attention can move outward. You notice more. You catch the micro-expressions, the small hesitations, the inconsistencies between word and tone. You observe the pattern rather than getting swept up in the isolated moment. Stillness also creates something interesting in the people around you. When you stop reacting, others fill the space. They speak more. They justify things you didn't accuse them of. They reveal motives and anxieties and desires that would have stayed hidden if you'd been filling the space with your own energy. Your calm isn't passivity. It's a kind of invitation, an invitation for reality to show up unobstructed. Emotional regulation as a strategic advantage. People who can regulate their emotional state in real time see farther than people who can't. They notice subtle shifts in energy before those shifts become obvious events. They catch inconsistencies before they compound into problems. They sense when something is off before it becomes a crisis. This isn't magic. It's what happens when you're not distracted by your own reactivity. Emotional regulation also protects you from two of the most common ways people get pulled off track: manipulation and emotional contagion. Manipulation almost always works through emotional triggering. It creates anxiety, guilt, excitement, or fear, and then uses that emotional state to influence behavior. A person who can observe their emotional state without being commanded by it is extremely difficult to manipulate. The trigger fires, but the response doesn't automatically follow. Emotional contagion is subtler. It's the way another person's panic, anger, or distress seeps into your own experience when you're not protected by regulation. You didn't start the conversation upset, but by the end you are, because you absorbed their emotional state rather than observing it. Emotional regulation creates the separation that makes this transfer less automatic. The observer's relationship with power. The calm observer doesn't seek power over other people. They seek clarity within themselves. This is a crucial distinction because it changes the entire orientation. When power is about others, it's inherently unstable. It depends on their cooperation, their recognition, their continued compliance. It requires constant maintenance. It's exhausting. When power is about internal clarity, it's self-sustaining. It doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior. It doesn't require approval. It doesn't need to be defended because it doesn't feel threatened by others. This is why calm observers are so often deeply respected by the people around them, even when they're not actively seeking that respect. Steadiness is recognized by the nervous system as safety. People orient toward it, especially in moments of tension or uncertainty. They look to the calm person for cues, often unconsciously. That influence, gentle, unforced, completely authentic, is among the most real forms of power that exists in human relationship. Choosing when to engage. One of the greatest practical advantages of the observer's position is selectivity. You don't have to respond to everything. You don't have to correct every mistake you notice. You don't have to address every inconsistency. You don't have to explain yourself to everyone who misunderstands. When you understand this, truly feel it rather than just know it intellectually, something releases. The compulsion to manage every interaction, to set the record straight, to make sure everyone sees things accurately, to never let a mischaracterization go unchallenged. That compulsion is exhausting, and it gives away enormous amounts of energy. The calm observer chooses engagement carefully. They speak when it matters. They act when it counts. They let go of what doesn't need to be carried. And this selectivity doesn't diminish their presence. It increases it. When they do speak, people listen. When they do act, it means something. The less noise you make, the more weight your signal carries. Closing. A final word before you step back into the world. You've just spent a significant amount of time sitting with some of the most fundamental truths about human behavior, about performance and authenticity, about the gap between words and actions, about emotional reactions and what they protect, about silence and what it communicates, about pressure and what it reveals, about the filters that distort your perception, about how to see clearly without losing your warmth. Before you close this book and walk back into your life, I want to say something that I think is more important than any of the specific insights you've encountered. Understanding people does not make you superior to them. It makes you freer. There's a version of this knowledge that people sometimes use to create distance, to build a kind of intellectual fortress from which they observe the flawed behavior of others with a certain detached satisfaction. That version, while it might feel safe, is ultimately lonely, and it misses the point entirely. The people you'll be observing more clearly are not performing and projecting and reacting because they're broken. They're doing it because they're human, because they have histories that shape them in ways they probably don't fully understand, because they carry wounds from experiences that were genuinely painful, because the nervous system defaults to what it learned first, and what it learned first wasn't always healthy. Seeing this with clarity, seeing that most people's difficult behavior comes from conditioning and fear rather than malice, is not an excuse for harm. It's an invitation to compassion, not the naive, boundary-free kind that exposes you endlessly, the grounded kind that allows you to understand limitation without being destroyed by it. You can see someone clearly and still love them. You can understand someone's pattern and still choose to be close to them, with appropriate awareness of what that closeness requires. You can observe someone's insecurity or reactivity and still treat them with dignity, while also making clear-eyed decisions about how much of yourself you invest. What changes when you see clearly? When you genuinely develop the capacity to read behavior over words, patterns over promises, and consistency over intensity, several things shift in your life. Disappointment becomes less frequent because your expectations are anchored in what's actually true rather than what you hoped would be true. This isn't pessimism, it's precision. You're still capable of hope and optimism. You've just learned to hope for things that have some evidence behind them. Confusion decreases. The experience of feeling blindsided by someone's behavior, that jarring moment where the person you thought you knew does something that doesn't fit the story, becomes rarer. Not because people become more predictable, but because you stop being surprised by behavior that was always there to observe. Your decisions become cleaner. When you're not trying to make sense of behavior through the lens of what you want it to mean, you can act from what you actually see. You can invest where investment is returned. You can trust where trust is earned. You can set limits without guilt and extend grace without being exploited. Your relationships become more genuine. This might seem counterintuitive if you're seeing people more accurately, including their limitations. Shouldn't that make connection harder? The opposite is true. Connection built on accurate perception of who someone actually is has a stability that connection built on projection or hope simply cannot have. You're not relating to your idea of a person. You're relating to the person. The work that turns inward. Perhaps the most unexpected gift of developing this skill is what it teaches you about yourself. As you become more skilled at noticing projection in your perception of others, you begin to catch yourself projecting. As you learn to recognize when hope is distorting clarity, you begin to notice when your own hope is bending your vision. As you develop the capacity to sit still and observe rather than react, you begin to observe your own reactions with new curiosity. You start asking, what is this reaction protecting in me? What does this trigger reveal about where I'm unresolved? Why does this particular behavior in someone else produce this particular response in me? These are not comfortable questions, but they are enormously productive ones. Because the journey inward, the willingness to see yourself with the same clear, non-judgmental attention you're developing for others, is what separates knowledge from wisdom. Knowledge says, I understand how human behavior works. Wisdom says, I see how I participate in it, and I'm learning to participate more consciously. That's growth, real growth, the kind that changes not just how you think, but how you live. The quiet life of a calm observer. In the end, the life of someone who truly sees people clearly is not a dramatic one. There are no grand reveals, no theatrical confrontations, no moments of triumphant exposure. It's quieter than that. It's the steady, grounded experience of moving through relationships with your eyes open, of extending care without illusion, of setting limits without resentment, of trusting observation over declaration, of staying warm and staying sane at the same time. It's noticing the gap between what someone says and what they do, and simply factoring that into how you relate, not with bitterness, not with performance of your own, but with calm, internal adjustment. It's letting behavior speak at its natural volume without rushing to turn down what you find inconvenient or turn up what you find hopeful. It's being the person in the room who isn't rattled when things get difficult. Not because you don't feel the difficulty, but because you've developed enough inner ground to stand on that the difficulty doesn't sweep you away. That steadiness is rare. And because it's rare, it's valuable, not just to you, but to everyone around you who is still learning to find their footing. Go be that person, not cold, not distant, not superior, just clear. Clarity protects your energy. Clarity preserves your peace. Clarity allows connection without illusion and distance without guilt. And when you live from that place, calm, aware, grounded in what's actually true, you move through life with a kind of quiet strength that confusion and deception simply cannot reach. You understand people, and because of that, you understand what is yours to carry and what isn't. You understand where to invest and where to step back. You understand at last how to be fully present in your own life. That is what it means to read people clearly. That is where real power begins.